From Acres USA, you are listening to the Acres USA podcast, a conversational podcast where we'll explore sustainable farming, regenerative practices, and the latest innovations in eco-agriculture with some of your favorite farmers and ranchers. I'm your host, Taylor Henry, the owner and CEO of Acres USA. Welcome to the Acres USA podcast. Let's talk about your background a little bit. So we're here joined with Chuck Benbrook. I think you probably can explain your background, what you've been working on your entire life a lot better than I can even try. So,
sure. So when I was just a young baby, 2-3 years old, I liked it when my grandma would set me out in the flower bed and I would play with the dirt. And my nickname as a kid was the farmer. And we lived in a house on Wilshire Boulevard in Los Angeles, for God's sake, about as far as from the farm as you could get. So I went through high school, through college, and I got bit by the Back to the Land movement, the Mother Earth News, the Whole Earth Catalog, in the '60s, I knew I was going to go to college, but I really wanted to get back to the land. I loved fly fishing. I liked working in the woods. And so when I graduated from undergrad school, I went to British Columbia and joined the Back to the Land movement. I was not a Vietnam, I didn't go to Canada to avoid the draft. I got 305 in the lottery, and I had a torn up knee, and I was a lifelong asthmatic. So the Army wasn't going to take me and put me in the jungle. But I wanted to live in the mountains, in nature, and just sort of figure out what I wanted to do with my life. So I moved to a very remote part of British Columbia. It was 15 miles to the nearest power. Nobody had lived where we ended up living since the 50s, for about a 50 mile concentric circle around where we live. So it was really wild, and it was wonderful, and I loved it. And but very hard to make a living, no power, you're off the grid. I made a little bit of money working in the sawmills in the winter, but we kind of got driven out of there by developers that had discovered that part of British Columbia. Made 50 grand or so from selling this very rural property that now was going to have power and a paved road and all that goes along with development. And this is 1973, and we moved to south of Burns Lake, British Columbia, and bought a 250 head Hereford cattle ranch, 600 acres deeded, 2 houses, 4 barns, full line of equipment on a beautiful lake, 2,000 acres of provincial grazing land, like a grazing lease, like we have in the States, same thing there. And I had maybe driven an old tractor for 20 minutes in my life. And because I had a good college degree from a respected college, and young, and had a little bit of money from the sale, we were able to get into this. It was a fabulous ranch, super well managed. He took his 250 heads of Hereford off, and I put 1,000 head of Corriedale sheep on it. And it was the craziest thing. I mean, to go from nothing. Well, we had a few sheep in the first place in British Columbia. We had maybe 20 head. We went from 20 to 1,000. And the ranch, the farm, was totally capable of raising the feed for 1,000 sheep and all that. All the fencing, of course, was for beef cattle. So we had a lot of work to do to make fences sheep tight. And I did one of the dumbest things of my life. We had about 400 acres of hayland, which was enough to grow the winter feed for the sheep. But I'm a go-getter, so I wanted to clear a bunch more land, because we had some fields that could definitely be converted. So we put some of the capital that we had into a D8 cat and tried to clear another 150 acres. And clearing land from the kind of forest you have around here to a cultivated hayfield, that's a lot of work.
Yeah.
And way more work than I had realized. But we did it, and we got that land into production. But then the Russian grain sale happened during the Nixon administration, and it crashed the livestock market. And the way we were making cash to pay the land payment and live is I was selling extra hay. We actually had extra hay despite the fact we had all those sheep. But the hay market just disappeared, and the livestock market was down, and we lost the farm. We went broke. And managed to keep it for 1 year after pretty much it looked like we couldn't. And so then what are we going to do? I'm 27, 28 years old. I have 2 babies, no money, walking away from this incredible experience that I'd had in British Columbia on these 2 properties. And so I went back to grad school. It's what some people do. They go back to school. And at the time, universities were, they were into attracting, new students to work in ag, and I wanted to do agricultural economics. And so when I started I had contacted Stanford and UC Berkeley and the University of Wisconsin-Madison, because my wife's parents lived 60 miles south of Madison, and Italian family, really into grandbabies. So it was kind of a no-brainer to go there when, they made me a great offer. Basically, I got a teaching assistantship that allowed me to get a PhD without any money, basically. And it was, I'm literally, we loaded a 1964 Oldsmobile Cutlass Cruiser station wagon with what we hauled away from 7 years in British Columbia and 2 babies, and left up there. We had to drive virtually straight from Burns Lake, British Columbia to Madison, Wisconsin, so that I could enroll on the last day of late enrollment for the beginning graduate school, the class year that I went back to graduate school. I made it a half an hour before late registration ended. We drove to Eagle Heights Married Student Housing, that's where they were putting us up. Got the Oldsmobile Custom Cruiser station wagon unloaded, got the babies in, and 8:30 the next morning, I'm walking into a graduate econometrics class with this great professor. And I had done, in terms of the world of mathematics, I had done nothing more than keep track how broke we were in a checking account. I hadn't done any calculus for 7 years. And bang, I'm in this graduate school. Half of the students were from Asia and were incredibly well trained. They already knew all of the advanced math and calculus that you needed to do econometrics. So they kind of breezed through the class, but oh man, it was really tough because I had to sort of remember the math that I had done 7-8 years ago. But anyway, I survived my graduate experience and got sucked into Washington, D.C. at the end of the Carter administration. President Carter started a whole bunch of very progressive agricultural initiatives as the president. He did the National Agricultural Land Study, which was the first federal study on the conversion of farmland to housing and urban development and the loss of farmland. It was a big issue at the end of the 70s. And so there were the Carter administration had a big set of reports to get out. And there was a thing back then, Taylor, called the Resources Conservation Act that Congress had passed. I think it was in the 76 Farm Bill or something. But it directed the executive branch to do a bunch of studies, and several of these studies were being managed by the Council on Environmental Quality, which is the part of the Carter executive branch that I got hired into, and while I'm finishing my PhD at University of Wisconsin-Madison. It was just a wild time. So I was there for the last 18 months of the Carter administration, and I kind of was the guy getting these reports done because they had to be out by inauguration, because absolutely nothing that, when the executive branch goes from Democrat to Republican or Republican to Democrat, whatever had been going on is over.
Yeah.
It just stops dead in its tracks. So there's a lot of pressure, and I was this young guy. I liked to ride. I worked hard, and it was a fascinating, wonderful year and a half. And there were people in D.C. that saw this young guy with a PhD in ag economics, Harvard degree, had farmed for 7 years in British Columbia. They wanted me to stay in town working on soil conservation, water quality, economics of farming, pesticide use, excessive fertilizer use. And so some people, they just said, we got to keep Chuck in town. And they went and found me a job. And it was kind of a miracle, because remember back then, Carter and the Democrats had the executive branch, the Democrats had the House, and the Democrats had the Senate. But with Reagan, Reagan won the White House and the Senate, so it was only the House that was still Democratic. So a bunch of the professionals that were working for the Senate in the ag space had to try to go get jobs in the House, and a bunch of people from the administration, who all lost their jobs on Inauguration Day, tried to get jobs in the House. And I was aware of that would be a good thing for me, but I'm just working my ass off. Now I've got 3 kids, no money, living paycheck to paycheck. But these friends of mine that I had helped them basically get their reports, things that they had devoted a big chunk of their life to, I helped them get them out before Reagan came in, and they got me in the door with a member of the House, George Brown, Congressman George Brown from California, who was the incoming chair of the subcommittee of the House Ag Committee that had jurisdiction over agriculture research, foreign trade, food, the USAID food program, and oversight of all of USDA, and one other little area that I didn't know anything about: pesticides. The Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, the authorizing committee in the House was the House Ag Committee, and the subcommittee that had to deal with all of the issues around pesticides was this Department Operations Research and Foreign Ag Subcommittee. That I got this. I stopped working for the Carter administration on Friday, and the next Monday I went into my new job with this wonderful congressman. He's a Quaker and an engineer, and just a wonderful human being. I loved my job. But boy, did I have to learn about pesticide law in a hurry, because agribusiness, the pesticide industry, they knew now's our shot. We've got Reagan in the White House. We've got a Republican Senate. Let's go fix FIFRA. And guess what? One of the 2 top issues was, well, I'll tell you what both of the top 2 issues were. Number one is they wanted to preempt the role of state pesticide regulation. That's what the industry wanted. And why? Because California was building a pesticide regulatory program of the same scale as federal EPA. And they were putting additional restrictions on how pesticides could be used in California to protect farm workers. If they didn't, they would be poisoning people. They'd be dying in the fields, for God's sake. So California had a very aggressive and in many ways effective regulatory program, mostly to protect farm workers. Because when you're growing broccoli and grapes and carrots, there's people in the fields and around the fields all the time that get directly sprayed. And if you're spraying them with an OP insecticide, you're hurting them and badly hurting some of them. So that's why California, the California Department of Food and Ag bitterly fought the effort by the pesticide industry to change the FIFRA statute to just be the be in and end all. What they wanted the Congress to change federal law so that once federal EPA registered a pesticide and said, okay, you can use Roundup on corn and soybeans, and you can only spray 1 pound of active ingredient at a time, and you got to wear gloves when you mix and load, and that's what's on the federal label. They wanted that to govern all pesticide use in all states, even states where the risks from the use of a federally registered pesticide are way different. And so the California Department of Food and Agriculture and other California ag interests were put up the opposition against the national pesticide industry, and they tried to change FIFRA and pass legislation, but they couldn't. They couldn't even pass it out of our subcommittee, because back then members of Congress worked together, Democrats and Republicans. It was nothing like it is today. I was as good a friend with some of the Republican members of the committee as I was the Democrats, and one of them was Pat Roberts, from Kansas, who started his career in Congress in the House and then became senator for like ever. He just retired, I guess maybe 4 years ago or something like that. Pat Roberts and George Brown got along really well. And I got along really well with Pat. And Pat understood how bad it would be if preemption happened, because then his farmers in Kansas, they might get poisoned by pesticides and they wouldn't be able to do anything about it, because the pesticide industry passed sort of this, as long as they get the EPA to grant a federal registration for a pesticide, then they can't be sued for any problem. So preemption was the big issue in 81, 82, 83, when I'm in my 30s, and I'm the staff director of this subcommittee. And the other big issue, pesticides and cancer. And I've been involved with pesticides and cancer my entire career. And in 2016, I was asked to become involved in the Roundup non-Hodgkin's litigation that was just getting started. And I had been dealing with Roundup and glyphosate professionally in a significant way for 35 years. I knew way more about Roundup and glyphosate than almost everybody that was involved in the litigation. And so the lawyers were delighted to have me. And then because I signed on, and you sign a protective order that all of the sealed documents that Monsanto had to give the attorneys for the plaintiffs, right? It's all their internal emails going back into the 70s, for God's sake. So once I started to work on that litigation, I revisited 30 years of history about glyphosate from the perspective of Monsanto, from their own emails to each other, the emails and notes of meetings where they plotted how they were going to keep Roundup on the market and keep growing the sales. And of course, Taylor, that was a big deal once they knew they were going to bring Roundup Ready technology onto the market. They knew that the sales of Roundup were going to go up tenfold or more if they got Roundup Ready technology onto the market. So I was heavily involved with what was going on in that era around the testing of glyphosate, the assessment of glyphosate oncogenicity, et cetera. And then I get involved with this litigation. And not only did I have access to all of the records and the internal emails from Monsanto, but somebody was paying me to spend a lot of time getting way down deep into the weeds. And what I learned was just, it was just, it's a hell of a story. And I've been very blessed and proud to contribute to this litigation. And for the most part, this litigation, it's had such a huge impact on the pesticide industry already. I mean, Monsanto is going to go down in history as a pariah corporation. There will be nothing positive of their legacy when people really come to understand what they did with Roundup, glyphosate, the greatest herbicide ever discovered, maybe the greatest herbicide that will ever be discovered. And they haven't ruined it, but they've so grossly mismanaged it that it's not nearly as beneficial for farmers and society as it could have been. And then Monsanto controlled the introduction of biotechnology into food. I mean, they were the big players. They had BT corn and BT cotton and Roundup Ready crops. And the way that they mismanaged that, again, to enrichen the corporation and the investors in the corporation, and basically screw farmers in rural America. It's just, when people understand that full story, and they will someday, there's a lot of people that already understand it. And that's been the story of my life the last 10, 15 years.
Hey everybody, hope your spring and summer is going well for you. We have 2 summer events that we want to make sure that we talk about. Number 1, June 21st in Gaston, Indiana at Jason Mock's farm. John Kemp, Gary Zimmer, Jason Mock will be speaking at our first annual Farm Weird on Farm event. It is June 21st, 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. Half the day will be presentations, and then the other half of the day we'll get out in the field and actually see a live harvest, see some of Jason's relay cropping, in-crop grazing, perennial systems. Jason's got a really incredible farm, and we're excited to be out there. The other event is July 11th, and is our second annual Viroqua on Farm event. It'll be in Viroqua, Wisconsin, 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. Our speakers for that are Will Winter, Steve Campbell, Gary Zimmer, and Brian Dotery from Understanding Ag. And this one we will talk about livestock, regenerative grazing techniques, holistic animal health, and grazing economics. Head to the description. We'll have links for both events in there, and we hope to see you at one of these events this summer. What was it like in the 80s as far as, I'm assuming the pesticide research was coming in first, where people started realizing, it's not just this perfect thing. We have some issues we got to deal with here. But what was it like as far as these large corporations trying to either control the research? What was the research like?
Well, first, great question. When I was the staff director of this subcommittee, and I did it for 3 years, 1981, 82, and 83. At that time, there were 20 significant pesticide companies. 20. And honest to God, Taylor, there were several weeks where I was taken out to lunch 5 days a week to Bullfeather's restaurant, which was just a block from my office in the Longworth Health Office building, and I had a ribeye steak and would talk with the pesticide industry lobbyists. And of course, they're lobbying me, right? They want to get to know who's the staff person that's going to be, writing amendments, but they also educated me. One of my favorite people was a guy named Dr. Chester Dickerson. He was the Monsanto lobbyist that worked on the Hill, and he was a really nice guy, and he was a good scientist, and he was kind of at the tail end of his career. And yeah, he lobbied me and told me about how safe Roundup was, but he also taught and helped teach me about what's in FIFRA and what the EPA was doing. So back then, the pesticide industry was much more diversified. There was 20 important companies, and now there's four. And the four, yes, they're definitely competitive with each other, but all of this money that's been spent in the Midwest and around the country to support the preemption bills that we talked about a little bit earlier, this huge campaign, almost all of it's been paid for by Bayer, Monsanto, and Syngenta. Why? Because Bayer Monsanto is losing a significant number of the Roundup non-Hodgkin's lymphoma lawsuits that go to trial, and some of the juries, after they hear the evidence, are so moved by the irresponsible behavior of Monsanto Bayer that they're awarding punitive damage awards, hundreds of millions of dollars, and the last one in Georgia, like 4 weeks ago, was $2 billion for one person.
Yeah.
And so when a corporation gets hit by a jury with a $2 billion punitive damage award, that sends a pretty compelling message that juries, after hearing the evidence, say, these companies, how can they get away with what they've done? And of course, Syngenta, that's now responsible for paraquat and Parkinson's disease, they are anticipating a very rough time when the paraquat Parkinson's disease cases start going to trial. And it is going to be very, very hard on them. It's going to cost them hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars, because Syngenta and its predecessor companies manipulated science, misled regulators, misled the scientific community for 30 years about what they knew about how paraquat was likely contributing to Parkinson's disease among people spraying paraquat herbicide. They basically knew it, Taylor, in the 1980s.
Yeah.
And that is all going to come out at trial. It's all going to come out at trial. What they did to hide what their own science was showing. And boy, I'll tell you, juries are not going to like it.
What was the science showing, and how were they able to hide it?
What the science showed by the mid-'80s was that paraquat was passing through the blood-brain barrier, and it was in the brain. And they had one of the reasons that now back at the time it would have been Novartis, right? Because if you so paraquat started out with ICI, Empirical Chemical Industries, the largest chemical company in the UK. So in the 60s, they discovered paraquat and brought it to market around the world. But ICI didn't have a presence in the US pesticide market. So they did a partnership with Chevron that was a big player in pesticides in the 60s and 70s. So Chevron brought Gramoxone, the brand name for most paraquat that's been used in the U.S. since the mid-60s, was first brought to the market by Chevron, but Chevron bought the paraquat from ICI. But then ICI sold its ag chem division, and there was about 5 rounds of changing companies and merging companies, resulting ultimately in the creation of Novartis. And then Novartis merged with some others and created Syngenta. And then ChemChina, a wholly owned state enterprise owned by the Chinese government, bought Syngenta and also took over all of the liability of all of the pesticides that Syngenta is currently selling, including paraquat. So as the litigation over paraquat and Parkinson's disease unfolds in the U.S., it's going to be a very interesting geopolitical issue, because if juries start to award large punitive damage awards, and Syngenta has to pay $10 billion over the next 5 years because of the connection between paraquat and Parkinson's disease, $10 billion from ChemChina. And guess who owns about 40% of the stock of ChemChina? The Chinese Communist Party. And this is going to be, I guarantee you, there's going to be calls between President Xi and President Trump about this crazy litigation in the U.S. and what your court systems are doing. And it's just, it's going to be really something to watch it play out. But that's why Syngenta has joined with Bayer to try to pass legislation in all these states that would prevent failure to warn claims being used as a basis for suing Bayer Monsanto over Roundup and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, or suing Syngenta over paraquat and Parkinson's disease.
How did, like Chinese government has always been considered some sort of a hostile thing with America. How could we have allowed another country's government to have so much control for what's being sprayed over all of our acres?
Taylor, you don't even know how ironic your question is. The Chinese government has banned paraquat in China. You with me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Paraquat has actually been banned by, I don't know, it was 60, 70 countries. And probably the country that is most behind the science and protecting farmers and applicators from the use of paraquat in the world is the United States. Taylor, I want your listeners to think about this. It is still legal to spray paraquat as a pre-harvest desiccant on wheat. Not much, it doesn't happen very often, but it's still legal. And that is crazy, because when you use a herbicide like paraquat or Roundup as a pre-harvest desiccant on oats, barley, wheat, edible beans, the pesticide is being sprayed a couple of weeks before harvest. The grain's fully formed, the bean is fully formed. So you spray one of these herbicides on that crop right before harvest, the residues are going to be 20, 50, 100 times higher than they would otherwise be. And so the fact that the US EPA is still allowing paraquat to be sprayed on human food crops right before harvest is the most chilling example of how broken our regulatory system is. It's unbelievable that is still possible. And it's not like it's a big secret. Many people have known that this has been going on and have tried to get EPA to at least stop the pre-harvest desiccation uses. So anybody in America that isn't eating mostly organic food it has glyphosate in their urine almost every day for their whole lives. And it's because of these pre-harvest crop desiccation uses of glyphosate-based herbicides, including Roundup. It's not all the Roundup used on Roundup-ready soybeans and corn. People don't eat those crops. They get fed to animals, they get converted to biofuels, they get converted to oil, or in the case of corn, into high fructose corn syrup. All of those uses of corn and soybeans in the U.S. result in essentially zero human exposure through the diet.
Well, I always blame that on the reason why we have such a gluten intolerance.
That may be.
Yeah.
The glyphosate is known to trigger immune responses. There's been multiple studies in tissue culture and mice, rats, rabbits, and people that have documented that glyphosate triggers an immune response, mostly in the gut, in the microbiome. So it's not a huge leap to think that glyphosate for some people may be triggering what's in effect a food allergy. Mm-hmm. And I know Dr. Huber has talked with you about that. And I know that there are scientists that are convinced that glyphosate does play a role in gluten intolerance, but it's not. It's still contested science in the biomedical and public health community, or you'd see a warning, on loaves of whole wheat bread, but it could be.
Well, I always tell people, like, think about how you feel after eating pasta from, a normal like just conventional pasta or bread versus eating like homemade sourdough bread. Like you feel completely different. But going back to the Monsanto, I think it's really interesting how you were able to, look essentially under the hood of what was happening there. What were some of the communications that you were seeing that was like the most alarming? That they saw the science, they knew about the science, and they were purposely circumventing or hiding it?
And I need to acknowledge that I'm still a testifying expert in the litigation, and this podcast will be dissected in great detail by several Monsanto Bayer attorneys to see if I say something that can be used against me in court to display that I'm a biased scientist, I'm an activist scientist, I'm on a vendetta against Monsanto, I don't like biotechnology, whatever. Take your pick of reasons why Bayer, Monsanto, Syngenta, and other chemical companies would like to shorten my career as a testifying expert. And because of that, I have to be very guarded in how I respond to a question like what you just answered. So I want the audience to understand that, because they might say, why is he sort of talking in code so much? And it's because I don't want to get my ass licked, in my next deposition. Oh, on your podcast with Taylor Henry, you said this. So to your question, what I and other experts in the Roundup litigation have learned is that in 1983, Monsanto submitted a cancer study in mice to the EPA. It was a replacement study for one of the invalid IBT studies. And some of the older people that are listening to this podcast, they might remember something about IBT. IBT stands for Industrial Biotest Laboratories, and it was a big contract lab company that did tests for the pharmaceutical industry, the pesticide industry, the fuels industry, industries that produce chemicals that could be toxic. But they grew really fast, and they became bereft with fraud. They were faking studies, they were rigging data, and they were giving the companies studies that showed no risk when actually a bunch of the animals had died or something had happened. And this was a huge scandal in the late 70s and early 80s that on the pesticide side of the scandal, it broke through the subcommittee I worked for, because an EPA whistleblower came to me and said, oh, by the way, your committee might want to know that about 2/3 of the pounds of pesticides applied in the early 80s in U.S. agriculture were supported by invalid, fraudulent toxicology studies, including paraquat and Roundup. Well, yeah, that was kind of a big deal. So, Monsanto had to admit that, the studies, all of the companies that had paid for work at IBT admitted, it's a bad lab, but we didn't have anything to do about it. We didn't know there was any problems with their lab.
So is that like the that's like the shield, is they have this third party lab do
It's
the
part,
research.
yeah,
And then,
sure, it's part of it. But so Monsanto had to do a replacement study. And so they did that at another big contract lab that wasn't anything like IBT. It's called Biodynamics. And that first valid cancer study on glyphosate that went into EPA, there was data in the study that showed a statistically significant increase of what's called a renal tubular adenoma. That's an unusual, even rare kidney tumor. And it was only in the male mice, not in the females. And it was a relatively low incidence, but the Biodynamics put it in the report, but also said, we don't think this is important. It wasn't in the females. It was a really high dose in the top dose. So in the report that Biodynamics submitted to Monsanto, Biodynamics had already tried to explain away these renal tubular adenomas. And then, of course, when Monsanto then put its interpretation of the study on top of the biodynamic interpretation of the study, they expanded the arguments for why no big deal about these renal tubular adenomas. They weren't treatment related, biologically insignificant.
So healthy you can drink it.
Well, not quite that far. So the study goes into EPA. I think it went in 83. It was around February or March of 84 when the toxicology branch finally got to evaluating this replacement study, because in the early 80s, all of the chemical companies were having to redo all of these invalid studies. So EPA was buried with new studies. They were way behind in evaluating. This guy named William Dykstra, one of their very experienced toxicologists, who I met with him multiple times, because that was right when I was working on the Hill on pesticides. So I was meeting with EPA scientists, and I knew these people some of them pretty well. Dykstra looks at the data and disagrees with Biodynamics and disagreed with Monsanto and said, I'm worried about those renal tubular adenomas. And so he classified glyphosate as a possible human carcinogen in 1984. And that was the status. That was the status of glyphosate from 1984 to 1991. In 1991, EPA changed its mind and altered the cancer classification of glyphosate from a possible human carcinogen to not likely to pose a cancer risk. Hugely significant decision. Very controversial decision. Very controversial in EPA. And the reason Monsanto, one of the big reasons that Monsanto and Bayer have had such a tough time with this litigation is because the litigation has brought into the public what Monsanto did from early 1984 to 1991 to get EPA to change its mind, which was it was a hundreds of millions or billion-dollar decision to Monsanto, because Monsanto knew in a few more years they were going to be selling Roundup Ready crops, and Roundup Ready technology could not take off like it did if glyphosate was still classified as a possible human carcinogen. It wouldn't have happened. It couldn't happen. So they had to get EPA to change. And they basically made it clear to the management of EPA, all the way up the chain to the administrator of EPA, and then into the White House to the president, that they were going to do whatever they had to do to get the Office of Pesticide Programs to change the classification of glyphosate from possible to not likely. And when a chemical company tells a regulatory agency that they're basically going to commit whatever resources, in terms of, oh, we'll do new studies, we'll hold conferences, we'll lobby Congress, we'll do all these things until we get what we need. The people in the regulatory agencies, they say, oh man, if we're really going to take on a big, aggressive, politically connected company like Monsanto on a question, and it's really important that people understand glyphosate is not a potent carcinogen. There's no evidence that it's a potent carcinogen. And in fact, many scientists still waffle. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. It's not a slam dunk science call. However, it's gotten much clearer in the last 5 years that yes, glyphosate and glyphosate-based herbicides have been contributing to blood cancers, including non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And it's really been work coming out of the National Cancer Institute that has really settled some of the underlying scientific questions. But the fact that the litigation made it possible for a group of people, and I'm talking about 40 or 50 people that have been involved in this. These would be lawyers and experts, oncologists, toxicologists, the people that worked on behalf of farmers and landscapers and just people that had rural properties and sprayed a lot of Roundup and got non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Because of the litigation, several people were given the chance to uncover what Monsanto did from early 1984 to 1991 to change the classification of Roundup, of glyphosate. It's so outrageous what they did, and that's because that story got told really well in the first 3 trials. Bayer Monsanto lost the first 3 trials right in a row, and that just blew up the litigation. It's an incredible story, and the fullest version of it is in Carrie Gillam's first book about the litigation. She tells the whole story, and what she lays out in the book, I've got 90 pages in my expert report about how Monsanto pulled the wool over the eyes of EPA, the Office of Pesticide Programs, and at the end of the day, they politically got their way, and it's a sad story because it shows how, the EPA, when it started out, people really did care about the environment.
Yeah.
And we have made progress with cleaner air and cleaner water. And we have made progress with how garbage dumps and hazardous waste dumps are managed. And in the 80s, there were some really important steps taken to make pesticides safer. But basically, from the late 80s on, the Office of Pesticide Programs and the EPA has experienced this high level, what you call industry capture, where the registrants, the companies, Monsanto, Bayer, Dow AgroSciences, DuPont, now Corteva, Syngenta, Novartis, these companies have so much sway over what the Office of Pesticide Programs does, and they'll just keep working at changing their mind for 10 years, for 20 years, however long it takes, and they have essentially unlimited resources. So that's why things have gotten so out of whack with how pesticides are being regulated in the U.S. And it's rural people, rural towns, farmers, and people who make their living spraying pesticides. Somebody's got to do this work. People that work in the factories, manufacturing and formulating pesticides, they get exposed. It's really a tragedy because there's a level of toxicity that has been brought into onto the continent and into rural America that is completely unnecessary.
Hey there. Did you attend our EcoAg conference this year in Madison, Wisconsin? Well, if you didn't, or if you did, we've got the recordings now available. Get on-demand access to every session with the EcoAg recordings. Learn directly from the pioneers of soil health, livestock integration, and profitable regenerative systems, all at your own pace. Speakers include Gabe Brown, Alan Williams, John Kemp, Joel Salatin, and a lot more. We also have additional products that include the full-day workshops done by Matt Powers, John Kemp, Nigel Palmer, Jordan Green, Mark Shepard, and Austin Unruh. These workshops are in depth and will help you dig deep on the presenters' topics. Grab your recordings now at conference.eco-ag.com/24 recordings or find the link in the notes. Because the best investment you can make is in your own knowledge. Now back to the show. All right. So these are the two books by Carrie Gilman. Go ahead. You can continue there.
So, Taylor, take whitewash. Why did she put whitewash in the title? Because of what Monsanto did from the early 1984 to 1991 to change EPA's mind about the cancer classification of glyphosate. They whitewashed the science that suggested there was a connection between glyphosate and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. It took her a book, it's what, I don't know, 296 pages to lay out all of the things that Monsanto did in that 7 years to get EPA to change its decision about glyphosate and cancer. And it's a very important story to understand, because if we're going to fix the risk assessment process and the regulatory process in the United States, people have to understand how the chemical companies, the registrants, have gained such a high level of control over what the government is doing in this area.
What do you believe to be like what is the driving factor of this? Is it money and greed?
Well, yeah. I mean, the pesticide.
Have you ever thought that it was something more like dark?
Well, may I answer your question? Glyphosate and Roundup, it came on the market in 1974, and in 1996, so that's 22 years later, when Roundup Ready technology hit the market, right? Roundup and glyphosate was like number 16 out of the top 20 pesticides. It was an important herbicide, but it was not nearly as important as atrazine and metolachlor and alachlor, 2,4-D. Even I think there was probably more dicamba sold in the early 90s. So when Monsanto realized that they could use biotechnology to create Roundup Ready corn, soybeans, cotton, alfalfa, sugar beets, they knew that it was just going to be a huge increase in their profitability, because they would sell more Roundup, they would sell the genetically engineered seeds, they would license the genetic engineering technology to the rest of the seed industry. They used the profits and the economic power that Monsanto had in the early 90s as the lead company in biotechnology. Taylor, they bought the seed industry.
Yeah.
The pesticide industry bought the major seed companies, all of them, because they needed the seeds to deliver the genetically engineered crop seeds so that they could sell their herbicides to them. I mean, it was such a huge moneymaker that that was the game in town. It was the only game in town from the early 90s for about 10 years. Anybody active in the corn, soybean area or cotton, it was all about the new genetically engineered seeds, and this Roundup took off like crazy. And so the use of all the other herbicides, Roundup almost ended other herbicide use. So the degree to which Roundup Ready technology, so being able to spray a glyphosate-based herbicide over the top of a cotton, soybean, or corn field, was probably, if not the most dramatic change in agricultural technology in history. It was damn close. The degree to which it changed so much in the production of these three major global crops. And of course, the money that was being made, and the corporate fortunes that were changing in terms of stock value, nothing had ever been even come close to it in the pesticide and seed industry. And the day when DuPont bought the last part of Pioneer was one of the saddest days in my professional career, because Pioneer was a great company that cared about farmers. It was so deep in their DNA. They weren't going to change, but they were a publicly traded company. They could not avoid being bought by one of the chemical companies. And so, I think they preferred to be bought by DuPont. And so finally it happened. It wasn't because Pioneer wanted to become part of a chemical company. They had no way to defend themselves because they're a publicly traded company. Anybody could just buy up all the Pioneer stock on the market, and then they'd own it, right? So when Pioneer got bought up, the rest of it by DuPont, was the saddest day in my professional career, because I knew a lot about Pioneer, and they really cared, and they supported public research, and they cared about rural America. And when that voice was lost, that's what set off basically the corporate takeover of the land-grant university system in the Midwest. It just changed everything, changed the politics of farm groups. And so the scope of the change impacting corn, soybean farmers and livestock farmers in the Midwest, from the pesticide industry buying the seed industry, using biotechnology to fundamentally change the seed pesticide, the role of them in cropping systems. It was such a tsunami. It just changed everything. Now, but there is something else. You asked, what really drove the companies? Was it just money? No, it wasn't just money. And I have to be very careful in how I say this, but here's what I believe to be the case. I believe that there was such a unanimity of opinion in the companies, in the university system, among farmers, farm magazines, about how terrific ag biotech was and Roundup Ready seeds. And in the early years of Roundup Ready technology, it truly was. It was amazing technology. It turned the hardest management task facing corn, soybean farmers in the Midwest, dealing with weeds, herbicide carryover, interactions between herbicides and fertilizers. It was a mess. Farmers hated it. They were spending way more money on herbicides and getting way worse results. Along comes Roundup Ready, and it was so easy to have just completely clean fields. You almost couldn't screw it up. So of course farmers loved it, and the industry loved it, and everybody wanted to get in on the gravy train. Everybody. The land-grant universities were getting money from the companies to do research, to advance ag biotech. And what happened was, in my opinion, there was a new ethos about the safety of Roundup, safe enough to drink. You could put your hand in a barrel of it. You're not going to get sick. That's true. You can do that. You could put your hand in a barrel of 40% Roundup, and you're not going to get sick, especially if you wash it off pretty quick. And what happened was people in the companies, especially the non-scientists, they started to believe their own PR. They really came to believe deep in their souls that glyphosate's safe. I mean, there's 800 studies that show that it's safe. All the regulators around the world show that it's safe. And you know, people in Monsanto and farmers knew that they could get it on their bodies. They could. Farmers were blowing out clogged nozzles that had just been spraying Roundup, and it wasn't hurting them. So they figured it's got to be safe, right? So what I think has happened is that inside these big corporations that are very big now, if as a newly hired person, a professional, whether you're on the marketing side, the regulatory side, the science side, corporate relations side, for you to advance in those companies, you've got to believe the story, the view of the company about their technology. And in Monsanto, it was glyphosate safe. We know it's safe. We've done all these studies. We know it's safe. So if somebody comes along that has done an independent study, or if even one of the Monsanto commission studies done at a contract lab started to show what looked like some adverse effect, there has to be something wrong with the study. Has to be, because they know it's safe. It's not they think it's safe or they believe it's safe. They know it's safe. And I believe that a level of what you could call, it's somewhere between hubris and arrogance and ignorance, took hold in Syngenta in the case of paraquat, in Monsanto in the case of Roundup, and allowed the corporation and all the people in the corporation to fight, to contest all of the evidence that was coming along that suggests, hey, let's not take a bath in Roundup. Let's be careful with it. Let's wear gloves when we mix and load it. Is that such a imposition on people? Monsanto has fought wear gloves while you mix and load Roundup on the labels.
Yeah, they wouldn't admit any.
Admit to anything.
Yeah.
And that ethos, that set of values is what I think has really gotten us in trouble, because these corporations, they truly believe that their technology is safe. And so anybody a Don Huber, professor at Purdue, that starts to see a link between soybean sudden death syndrome and Roundup Ready technology, he's got to be wrong. And so you attack him. You drive him out of the system. You make sure that his graduate students have to go to Brazil to get a job after they get a PhD out of Purdue. It's really the degree to which the pesticide seed industry is basically at the heavy duty research level. It's one industry. Now there are some really important independent seed companies still, of course, that they sell Roundup Ready seeds, they sell BT corn, but they're not bought into it like the technology developers are. And Stein is the best example. I mean, what's the guy that founded Harry Stein? Is that right? He's written some of the most compelling critiques of what he thinks genetically engineered corn and soybean seeds have done to the Midwest. He thinks it's been very negative. And I would agree with him. It has been very negative.
Hey, Eco Farmers. This is Taylor Henry with Acres USA. I hope you enjoy this podcast as much as I enjoy interviewing these folks. If you're serious about regenerative agriculture, I've got an incredible resource you need to check out, the Acres USA membership. You farm in the physical world, and you deserve a physical printed magazine to match. Since 1971, Acres USA magazine has been the leading voice in ecological agriculture, delivering the best insights from regenerative farmers, agronomists, and researchers to help you farm profitably without toxic chemicals. Our membership included physical and digital copies of the magazine each month of the year, which has always been a standard for Acres USA, but we wanted to over-deliver on content. When I acquired this business, I was happy to find that we had years of audio files from presentations at our annual EcoAg conference. And guess what? They were hiding. Well, not anymore. We developed this membership portal that gives you access to the recordings from farmers like Gabe Brown, Gary Zimmer, Joel Salatin, and Mark Shepard. We also include recordings of private events. Finally, if you are like me and you like listening to content, we are now producing a membership-only podcast of each issue of the magazine, so you can consume each article while you're out in the field. To make things even sweeter, you'll get discounts on books, workshops, and events to keep expanding your knowledge. So are you ready to take your farming to the next level? Join today for a ridiculously low price at eco-farming.com or see details in the notes. Well, the overarching argument that I'm sure what you were talking about, where they truly believe they are helping, is, people would starve without it.
Yeah.
We would have world
they
hunger.
They believe that. They truly believe it. And if you kind of put yourself in their shoes for a while, that's all they hear from everybody. It's kind of when you get in an echo chamber and you're hearing the same thing over and over from all the people that you work with, the university professors, you go to a conference, that's what you hear. You tend to come to believe it. And Taylor, we've had 30 years of that message driven into the brains of people involved in corn, soybean agriculture. And so anybody that doesn't share that view is regarded as an enemy, as a pariah. And that's the story of Don Huber's career and my career. The industry doesn't, they don't appreciate what I've done, despite the fact that, what did I tell you? I just told you that Roundup was probably the greatest herbicide that has ever been discovered. And if you say, well, Chuck, how do you feel about it today? Guess what? I feel exactly the same way. The problems with glyphosate and Roundup and other glyphosate-based herbicides is how it's been used and the failure of stewardship. In 1986, Taylor, the US EPA required Monsanto to put on the labels of Roundup being sold to farmers, maybe to your father, wear gloves when you mix and load and apply, and chemical-resistant boots. They wanted Monsanto to put that on the label to begin to, because at that time, EPA thought that glyphosate was a possible human carcinogen. And guess what? It was. Yeah. They were right. It was then and remains, if not possible, maybe probable. But Monsanto fought it. They fought the EPA. And it again, this is another 40 pages in my expert report. Why and how Monsanto basically refused to do what the EPA required them to do. And they won. They won. So when a chemical company really decides to not do what a regulatory agency wants, they have ways to fight that battle, often for years, and at the end of the day, prevail. And that's what's so sad. Roundup could have been used so much more safely. I'm not saying that if what Monsanto should have done in the 80s, they should have put a cancer warning on the label. They should have required some PPE, gloves, chemical-resistant boots, long sleeve shirt, long sleeve pants. A lot of the people in the litigation, Taylor, they sprayed Roundup walking around with a handheld sprayer with flip-flops or sandals and shorts on, and they would walk right through where they sprayed because they'd been told it was safe. And they didn't get sick. They didn't get a rash. And so they thought it was safe, but it wasn't safe, because once it gets in your blood, The blood goes into your bone marrow. Your bone marrow is where there are stem cells, hematopoietic stem cells, that become white blood cells, red blood cells, and when a chemical that can mutate damaged DNA comes into contact with stem cells, what happens is a mutation that can start that cell on the path to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma or to leukemia or other blood cancer. That's where it starts. And as a result of the litigation, a lot of scientists now understand this now. But it took years. The litigation's been going on for 8 years. It took all that time for the pieces to get put together. And I mean, I unfortunately believe that the troubles for Bayer, Monsanto, and other pesticide companies that are selling glyphosate-based herbicide, Syngenta's got Touchdown. That's a glyphosate-based herbicide. It could be contributing to blood cancer. So the impact on the pesticide industry of the refusal to steward glyphosate more aggressively, to at least keep exposures down as much as you can. Yeah, go ahead, farmers, keep using it, but use it safely.
Yeah.
That's the real tragedy of this, because that was possible.
And they would be probably a lot safer in these litigations if they just had those warnings.
Absolutely.
Most of the people in the litigations are folks who are using heavy doses, landscapers, farmers. Is there any other type of people that are?
Yes, there are. And you have, some of them are your neighbors. There's a lot of people that buy a smaller rural property or a big lot on the edge of suburbia, or they've got there's a farm in their family that they visit, or they've got a hunting lease that are kind of anal about controlling weeds.
Yeah.
And a lot of those people, they started using Roundup in the 80s. And many of the people in the litigation had used Roundup for 20 or 30 years. They had sprayed Roundup 20, 40, 60 times a year for 20 or 30 years and didn't take any precautions to keep spray solution from landing on their skin because they'd been told it was safe, and they never got sick. So they concluded that, well, I guess Monsanto's right. Maybe it is safe enough to drink. It's never been safe enough to drink. And the problem is that, as I said, when spray solutions falls on human skin, it goes through the skin into the bloodstream. For the same reasons, you spray it on a weed, it's got to get through the epidermis of the weed to get inside the weed to kill it. The same surfactants that they put in Roundup to make it an effective herbicide accelerate the movement of glyphosate through human skin for exactly the same chemical reasons. Don Hubert spoke about that in the interview that came out in Acres USA. Once it's in the bloodstream, it is immediately being pumped with blood through into bone marrow. 10% of our cardiac output as living, breathing human beings is being pumped through our bone marrow for our entire lives. Why? Because it's inside the bone marrow is where all these hematopoietic stem cells are that are producing all of the new white blood cells, red blood cells, platelets, and other chemicals that keep us alive. Most people don't know that every day in our bone marrow, there's like 1 billion new cells made every day. Think about all of the cell division and all of the rearranging of DNA that has to happen to produce 1 billion or 500 million white blood cells. White blood cells are that's your immune system, right? White blood cells are the boots on the ground of the immune system. A white blood cell wasn't born a white blood cell. It was born as a hematopoietic stem cell. And this is the wild part of this, Taylor. That hematopoietic stem cell has to be mutated, literally mutated. The DNA has to be damaged and rearranged for it to become a white blood cell. That's part of the genetic evolution from a hematopoietic stem cell to a functioning lymphocyte, white blood cell that can recognize a bacterial danger to your body, to my body, a viral danger. This genetic dance of how the immune system can figure out what to target and go after versus not. We started talking about celiac disease. That's autoimmune disease. So a lot of food allergies and autoimmune disease also start when a hematopoietic stem cell is mutated in the wrong way, in a way that can lead to a new allergy. So this is the new insight, the new science, that it's happening really fast. And America is without a doubt the leading source of cutting edge biomedical science that is uncovering how even low levels of exposure to certain pesticides are causing serious adverse health effects. It's happening and we're getting to understand it. But we have a regulatory system that's so inflicted with corporate capture that all of this new science isn't having any impact on how pesticides are regulated, or it's having a very delayed and muted impact. And my message to the Acres USA community is to say, hey, just like farmers want the latest in GPS technology to be able to do precision agriculture, to do a better job of farming, to keep their animals healthy, why don't we use the best science to regulate pesticides and regulate farm drugs? Because I'm telling you, one thing I have learned in my career, we could be producing the highest quality food, the safest food, while building soil health, while keeping our water clean, while having lots of birds and bees and fish, with hardly any impact on the cost of food, if we just cared about those things.
Well, a similar thing happened to Dr. William Albrecht at the University of Missouri.
Sure, yeah.
Talking about, if you correct the minerals and get your soil working the way you're supposed to, maybe we don't need all these chemicals. Yeah. What do you think, or not what do you think, what is the argument in these litigations as far as their reasoning for where these cancers are coming from if it's not coming from these chemicals?
Another good question. So there's been, in the Roundup non-Hodgkin's lymphoma litigation, there's like 175,000 cases have been filed. 175,000. Mm-hmm. That is a lot of people with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma that used a lot of Roundup. And about 120,000 of those cases have been settled or gone away. There've been less than 30 trials. I think it's maybe at 28 now, and that's since the first trial was in 2018. So that's 6 years ago. Over 6 or 7 years, there's only been 28, 29 trials. And Monsanto in media coverage says, well, we've won. They claim that they've won almost half of the trials. And yes, they've had some defense verdicts where they've won the trial, and whoever the plaintiffs were got nothing. The attorneys that spent a couple $1 million to take the case to trial get nothing. The argument that has worked the best and has played a key role in the defense verdicts has come from a single scientist who is a cancer expert, has published in Science magazine and other internationally top flight journals. And he believes his research and what he understands about the biology of cancer, he believes that most cases of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and leukemia and many other cancers are a result of just random copy errors, right? When these hematopoietic stem cells, they've got to change their DNA to become a lymphocyte. Mm-hmm. It has to get scrambled or they don't become a lymphocyte. And his argument, and he has published papers that he claims backs up his view of the science. He thinks that most of these blood cancers are just from a random error in DNA replication and cell division. That's nobody's fault. Can't do anything about it. And he's been a very good expert witness for defense, and several juries have believed his view of the science. But I can tell you, I am not a cancer biologist. I am not the person in the litigation whose job it is to critique this scientist's view of the world, but I have studied his research and the basis of his findings at some depth, and I agree with a large number of scientists from all over the world that do not agree with this man's views and his interpretation of the science. But he was able to get through the process, the vetting process, to be able to testify in front of several juries, and he won the cases for Monsanto, despite the fact that the science that he presented is very controversial.
Yeah. Well, I think we could probably go on forever, but I want people to Chuck is going to start being a guest columnist for us online and in the magazine. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you plan on writing and covering?
I really appreciate, Taylor, the chance to do some guest columns. I tracked Acres USA for 40, 50 years, and it has such a proud tradition. It's farmer led. And what I want to do is write a short column, just as much to the point as possible about what new science is showing about how we can farm better, how we can promote soil health, how we can have cleaner water, cleaner food, healthier babies, how we can do that by changing agricultural systems and technology, maybe changing regulatory policy. And so I want to sort of lay out, here's the opportunities to do better, but then I'm going to devote the second half of my short columns to why we haven't done it. Given that we know how to grow better crops, we know how to build soil health. It's not like we've got to invest in 20 years of science to understand how to grow safer, more nutritious food. We know how to do it. So I'm a policy guy. My whole career has been policy and politics involving food, agriculture, nutrition, regulation. The second half of my columns are going to be what has to change in Washington, D.C. in policy. We have to change laws. We have to deal with industry capture and corporate capture, which of course is Bobby Kennedy's one of his big themes. He feels that the pharmaceutical companies have had way too much influence on FDA. He probably is right about that. And he also believes that the pesticide companies have way too much influence on the decisions that EPA makes. And I totally agree with him. So I want to, because that's what I've worked on my whole life. I want to lay out in simple terms what has to change if Americans, if our country really gets serious about getting healthier. Because the reason that public health in America is going down the tubes, it's a national disgrace. It's a national disgrace. I just spent 3 weeks in Germany, got out in public, and in 3 weeks, I didn't see a single obese person, not one, and I saw maybe 4 overweight people in just regular Germany walking around the town square. the obesity metabolic syndrome crisis in America, it's so bad. It's got so much pushing it on. It's going to take 20 years to even probably turn the corner on it. And how my kids are going to pay for the health care for me and other people in our 70s, as medical technology is going to keep a lot of us alive for 20 or 30 more years with diabetes and heart disease and strokes. But the cost of the medical care, oh my God. How America has to make a decision. We have to make America healthy again, or we're going to be diverting so much of our public resources to health care and keeping metabolically ill people that have chronic diseases grounded in how lousy the American food supply is and how poor dietary choices have been in the last 30 years. It's going to sink this country. It's going to be way worse than tobacco and lung cancer, way worse than AIDS, way worse than COVID. It's already way worse than COVID. If you think about the impact of metabolic syndrome, overweight, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, stroke on America, it's just out of control. And I understand this now. I mean, I've lived it. Yeah. I was right on the edge of type 2 diabetes, weighed 245 pounds. Mid-morning, I was starting to get a sweaty brow and lightheadedness. I was having the standard glycemic crash. I said, oh, it's because I drink too much caffeine. I tricked myself. I fooled myself for a number of years, but then I did kind of figure it out. And so, I've been going down this road to try to get myself metabolically healthy. And I've made progress, and I also understand it. And so if there's one thing that I can do in writing a column with Acres USA, I want the farmers and the ranchers that they intuitively believe that if we can make our soil healthier, if we can make our animals healthier, America will get healthier.
Agreed. It's a beautiful way to stop. Thank you for listening to the Acres USA podcast, a podcast production of Acres USA. Find us on Spotify, Apple, Google Play, and other popular podcast platforms. Acres USA is North America's oldest publisher on production-scale organic and regenerative farming. For more than 50 years, our mission has been to help farmers, ranchers, and market gardeners grow food profitably, regeneratively, and with nature in mind. Find our books and other Acres USA media and learn about Acres USA events at acresusa.com. Read our online magazine at members.acresusa.com, and we'd like to thank Acres USA staff for their contributions to producing this podcast. This episode was edited and engineered by Weston Larson of Acres USA. We're grateful to our guests for taking the time to talk with us about their experiences.